This is Exeter St David's Station, about 1920, and it's here, so the story goes, that Penguin Books began. A young executive attached to the perennially failing publisher's Bodley Head, Alan Lane, allegedly on his return journey after taking tea with the still not so old herself, Agatha Christie, was on St David's, faced with the intimidating prospect of the long drag back to London, and wanted something to read. He headed for the station bookstall. The story, already unusual, gets a little odd at this point. In the early 1930s, the great age of British newspapers and magazines, the era of hundreds of intelligent dailies, weeklies and monthlies, the time when the printed word was, itself, radio, television, newsreel and internet rolled into one, was only just beginning to wane. And anyone who thinks this is the first 24-hour news era might reflect on this. In Britain's major cities until television, papers were being printed and distributed almost around the clock. The Nelson, Everyman and Oxford Classics imprints were all up and running. The newsstand at Exeter St David's would have been heavy with excellent options for the literate, intelligent traveller. And yet, we're told, Alan Lane could find nothing to read, and so decided to start Penguin Books, the first cheap mass-market paperback, to fill what was, he must have thought, obviously, a huge gap in the market. It's unusual as it is for a UK publishing house to have a creation myth for itself, a tale of origins, and this must seem an unlikely one, still more unlikely when you have a look at this. This is an Albatross book. Albatross were a German imprint, launched several years prior to Penguin, and was dedicated to providing high-quality paperback editions of major modern literary titles to a new literate mass audience. International copyright kept Albatross out of the environs of the British Empire, which is something of a shame because, look, what we have here is an unprecedentedly elegant paperback design, produced in gold and mean proportions, but essentially pocket size, bringing you the best writing at pocket money prices that almost anyone in work could afford. Because the Albatross imprint was forbidden to be sold within the British Empire, we must of course put down to coincidence Alan Lane's subsequent Penguin Books idea of paperbacks shaped according to the golden mean, bringing the best writing for sixpence, and all badged up with a bird on the cover. Like Newton and Leibniz's independent inventions of calculus, Albatross and Penguin Books are a vivid example of how human genius appears to deliver its revelations with more regard to time than location. That, or Alan Lane stole the Albatross idea entire and came up with a cock and bull story to sell to his already jittery board of directors, but heaven forfend. They saw, however, that Lane was not, and never had. They say, however, that Lane was not and never had been a popular man at Bodley Head, but we must put that down to partiality, and certainly not any idea that the board had a clear, unvarnished opinion of the young man's scruples and his business ethics. But whatever the truth of the matter, both the fundamental design of Albatross and Penguin was and is undeniably a cut above the paperbacks of the time. And Penguin's immediate enormous success proved that the Albatross idea could indeed translate to the UK market in the way Lane must have hoped. Penguins received immediate support from several major literary figures, most notably from George Bernard Shaw. But Bernard Shaw was a famous early adopter anyway, and from elsewhere came rumblings from the kind of people who always fancy themselves as guardians of the religion of real books. And these cheap, flimsy flop excrescences, like the e-books of today, were no kind of real book at all. Even in the trenches, the hardbound pocketbook, perhaps on India paper, had proved itself capable of keeping its integrity and looks far better than the disposable interlopers of Penguin from Bodley Head. No, these people would stick to real books, thank you very much. And spare the zealots some sympathy at least, because, elegant as Albatross books undoubtedly were, not all of the early Penguin design choices worked as well as some of the others. The stately blue of the first cover, Ariel by Andre Maurois, an encouragingly brave and left-field beginning, was followed, as you can see here, by the rather less successful orange that would be Penguin's default cover for the best part of 30 years. This rather tired shade now takes up huge chunks of shelf space in households and second-hand bookshops, without lending distinction to the shelves or the titles themselves, up and down the country everywhere. It's an odd choice of shade, one it's easy to imagine that Penguin got rid of when the time came without too much regret. It wasn't just the orange. The distinct, washed-out, rather snooty pale blue chosen of the intellectual non-fiction of the Pelican series, which, one might wonder, has got anything to do with an almost identical shade of ink in the German Pelican fountain pen range, one wonders. Anyway, that pale blue sucked any sense of anticipation or excitement out of the presentation of what were, after all, some of the leading works in international thought. And as leading works in international thought, maybe they deserved better. But for whatever reason, Penguin's pre-war designers, including the famous Dan Scheichold, reserved the best Penguin colourways for their most throwaway productions. British detective fiction was certain to have had a huge presence on the Exeter St David's bookstall that Alan Lane famously turned his nose up at. Yet, it was British detective fiction, the genre fiction in Britain between the wars, that Penguin not only made centre stage in their new range, but clad in the superb Great Western locomotive green that they'd keep, with variations, for the best part of 40 years. For collectors, of course, this works very well. Any sustained collecting of Penguin's early detective mystery issues is going to create a treat for the eye and result in an excellent retrospective of the best of a genre in the very editions that saw it reach its greatest heights. And it'll be a reading collection. Whereas many of the snooty Manchester City coloured Pelicans have long since been replaced or superseded in their fields, the stately green Penguin detective mysteries remain the best path through a wet Sunday afternoon at home that British culture has ever devised. Detective mysteries got the green. The explanatory Penguin specials got the red. It's that very same pillar-box red, confident and imposing, that post-war Tories feared the whole country could become under Attlee. It's the colour they feared the whole country would be painted. And well might they have feared, because these Penguins, pouring off the presses in the last days of peace and the first days of the war, were in many respects the uncontrollable Alan Lane's finest hour. The coming fight to the death against totalitarianism, the deeper thinkers realised, would need every last man, woman and child. They'd recruit every last woman and child to it in one form or another, and over many years. So it was imperative that these people be informed of everything that was at issue. And thus it was that Penguin Books, stolen in concept from fascist Germany as we've seen, redeemed themselves and redeemed their founder by reforging themselves as a fully democratic, universalist weapon used in the interests of the common people. Albatross Books closed down in 1939, never to return. The cream of German and Austrian publishing had in any case been relocating itself bit by bit to London, most famously in the case of Phaidon, of course, but Thames and Hudson also had émigrés inspiring it from the shadows. Penguins had begun with a stolen promise to make the best of literary culture genuinely available for all to own. And now it followed up with a promise of its own, to make politics genuinely accessible in a real unbowdlerised fashion to all. Penguin specials were so much more than propaganda. Alan Lane had induced not just any old hack or ghostwriter, but the men and women at the very heart of current affairs, to present the issues at length in a form that would then appear nationwide where everyone went. The station bookstalls, the paper shops, and ultimately the pubs. And with the promise that they'd keep on doing so, that this new regard, this new urgency, this new determination to democratise the issues of politics would go on, that this is how it would be from now on. At the heart of the Penguin project, then, was a promise that would steadily reprise itself across the whole of culture. Penguin Classics, bringing the ethos and core of an English public school education to everyone. Penguin Modern Painters, putting London's hippest galleries and the innovation of St Ives into your hands magnificently for a pittance, with no trace anywhere of condescending explanation. It belonged to you now, and you could take it on your own terms. as much a part of your birthright and inheritance as mine, pub or factory. And after the war, the Penguin poets would do the same thing again and do it beautifully. The greatest part of that promise, the promise inherent in Penguin books, was of course in the content, making what was between the covers universally available, implicitly treating every adult person on our island as worthy of receiving it and becoming involved in it, and as above all representative of a changing attitude. After the war, it would no longer be the case, ideally, that there be two nations, one privileged and appropriate, the other downtrodden and forgotten, ignorable. And the promise of Penguin books was repeated elsewhere, in slum clearances, in the modern Great Western Road factories, an end to poverty, filth, bad housing, and crippling work. It's an incomplete and unfulfilled promise, but one must think that if we had the tools to fulfill it then, or even to make a start, then it must be true that we have them now.